In this video, you'll learn why this aircraft became a source of fear for American pilots, and the true story of how the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, initially underestimated, became one of the most feared symbols of Japanese air power in the Pacific. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into forgotten air battles, hidden engineering secrets, and the war machines that shaped the fate of the Pacific. The story of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero cannot be fully understood without examining the aircraft that first stood against it on behalf of the United States, the Brewster F2A Buffalo. The Zero became America's main aerial enemy precisely because the U.S. Navy entered the war with a fighter that was wholly unprepared for the speed, agility, firepower, and range of Japan's revolutionary design. The clash between these two machines represents one of the most dramatic mismatches in aviation history, an encounter that shaped early American perceptions, created myths that would take years to dismantle, and forced the United States to rethink the very foundation of its air combat doctrine. When the Zero met the Buffalo, the difference was so extreme that it seemed almost incredible. American pilots initially believed the reports about the Zero's performance were exaggerated or even fabricated. But those illusions died quickly in the skies over Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and the approaches to Australia, where Buffalo squadrons were torn apart by Zero units operating with confidence, precision, and deadly efficiency. To understand how the Zero became America's greatest threat in the air, one must explore not only the brilliance of its design, but also the profound flaws of the Buffalo. Flaws that turned early encounters into catastrophic defeats for the Allies. The Zero was born out of a unique Japanese philosophy of warfare. Designer Jiro Horikoshi pursued extreme lightness, sacrificing armor and protection to give the aircraft unparalleled maneuverability and range. The Brewster Buffalo, on the other hand, represented the exact opposite approach. It was a heavier, bulkier machine designed with peacetime optimism, bureaucratic compromises, and outdated assumptions about what a modern fighter needed. By the time the United States entered World War II, the Buffalo was already obsolete. Its once promising prototypes had been weighed down by equipment, structural changes, and hasty production demands. What could have been a decent early war fighter became a slug, a slow, underpowered, poorly climbing machine with structural weaknesses and inadequate armament. And when American and Allied pilots tried to fight the Zero using the Buffalo, they discovered quickly and tragically that the two aircraft did not belong in the same era. Japanese pilots who transitioned to the Zero understood immediately that they were flying something extraordinary. It was astonishingly light, responsive, and precise. Even small stick movements produced dramatic changes in attitude. The aircraft climbed like a hawk and turned with a ghost-like smoothness. In contrast, Buffalo pilots often fought the controls, wrestling with an aircraft that felt heavy and lethargic. They complained about engine overheating, canopy issues, poor visibility, landing gear failures, and unpredictable handling at high speeds. When the two aircraft met in combat, the outcome was nearly predetermined. The Zero could outturn the Buffalo in every possible scenario. It climbed faster, accelerated better, had superior armament with its 20mm cannons, and, perhaps most critically, was flown by pilots with years of experience gained in China. Buffalo pilots, whether American, Dutch, British, or Australian, faced opponents who not only flew better aircraft, but had also refined their combat skills through relentless, unforgiving campaigns that honed them into some of the world's best fighter pilots. The Zero's legend grew in these early battles. Buffalo units were decimated over Malaya, Sumatra, Java, and the Philippines. Reports flowed in describing dogfights where the Buffalo seemed incapable of escaping, outmaneuvered at every turn, shot down in shocking numbers. One pilot described trying to shake off a Zero as like trying to outrun a shadow. Another recalled that his Buffalo felt like a brick in a whirlwind when Japanese fighters swarmed his formation. These experiences cemented the Zero's reputation as America's greatest enemy in the Pacific theater. It wasn't just the aircraft themselves that defined these encounters. It was the philosophies behind them. The Zero was built to dominate within a specific performance envelope: low to medium altitudes, moderate speeds, and tight, twisting engagements. It excelled in dogfights that rewarded finesse, patience, and precise control inputs. Japanese training placed immense emphasis on aerobatics and gunnery discipline, producing pilots who could exploit the Zero's strengths flawlessly. Conversely, the Buffalo required tactics it could not execute. It lacked climb rate, speed, agility, and endurance. Its design philosophy was outdated before the war even began. American Navy leadership had originally hoped the Buffalo would evolve into a frontline fighter, but its flaws became so obvious that the U.S. Navy replaced it with the F-4F Wildcat even before Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately, many Allied forces in Southeast Asia were left with Buffalo units because the United States had limited resources to supply modern aircraft to distant theaters. Thus, when the Zero arrived, it didn't merely outperform the Buffalo. It exposed every weakness the Buffalo possessed. The Zero's long range allowed it to appear unexpectedly, catching Buffalo patrols off guard. Its light construction made it nearly unbeatable in low-speed turning fights. Its cannons delivered devastating damage to the Buffalo's vulnerable airframe. The Buffalo could not dive away effectively because its structural limitations made high-speed dives dangerous and unpredictable. It couldn't climb to gain altitude advantage. It couldn't escape horizontally because the Zero was faster at most altitudes. In virtually every engagement profile, the Zero held the advantage. This made it not only a superior machine, but also a psychological weapon. Buffalo pilots entered combat with the knowledge that they were at a disadvantage even before the first shots were fired. As battles raged across the Pacific, the Zero's reputation grew beyond reality. Some American intelligence officers believed the aircraft was made of special alloys or powered by an engine beyond anything the United States possessed. There were rumors that it used secret lightweight materials or advanced aerodynamic principles unknown to Western designers. These myths emerged because the aircraft most often encountered by American forces during the war's early months was the Buffalo, and the Zero made the Buffalo look primitive. In truth, the Zero's performance was not magic. It was the result of extreme design choices. But from a viewpoint of those flying the Buffalo, the Zero seemed invincible. The Brewster Buffalo's failures also stemmed from organizational dysfunction. The Brewster Aeronautical Corporation was plagued by mismanagement, production delays, union conflicts, and design inconsistencies. Aircraft delivered to Allied units often had inferior engines, poorer build quality, or critical modifications omitted due to lack of oversight. The Buffalo gained weight with each new requirement, losing the agility that its earliest prototypes once had. Meanwhile, Japan refined the Zero's design continuously, improving its reliability and performance as experienced pilots provided feedback from the front lines. Because of this mismatch, the Zero became the face of Japan's early war supremacy in the Pacific. It wasn't just that the Zero was excellent. It was that the aircraft it faced were simply not in its league. The Brewster Buffalo, pulled into a war it was never designed to fight, became the sacrificial lamb whose defeat elevated the Zero to near-mythical status. American pilots learned quickly that survival depended not on matching the Zero's agility, but on developing entirely new tactics. They began to abandon turning fights, diving away whenever possible, using slashing attacks, and calling for reinforcements whenever Zeros appeared. But such adjustments came too late for many units armed with Buffalo fighters, which were overwhelmed before tactical doctrines could evolve. The battle between the Zero and the Buffalo fundamentally reshaped American military aviation. The shock of the Buffalo's failures forced the United States to accelerate development of better fighters, including the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair. These aircraft were designed specifically to counter the Zero, incorporating lessons learned from the tragic losses suffered by Buffalo squadrons. The Hellcat, in particular, became the Zero's executioner, a rugged, powerful, heavily armed beast that could dive, climb, and strike with overwhelming strength. But this transformation of American air power might not have happened so quickly had the Zero not demonstrated so dramatically the weaknesses of U.S. pre-war fighter design. In this sense, the Zero shaped the enemy against which it fought. Yet even as American aviation evolved, the Zero continued flying largely unchanged. Japan struggled to develop and mass-produce replacements. Its industrial capacity could not match American output, and its training program could not produce pilots with the skills needed to use the Zero effectively. Over time, the aircraft that once outclassed the Buffalo found itself facing fighters designed specifically to exploit its weaknesses. The Zero's fragility, once overshadowed by its unmatched agility, became its downfall. It could not absorb damage like American aircraft. It could not match their dive speeds, climb rates, or firepower. And it could not compensate for the loss of Japan's pre-war aviators, whose skill had been the true weapon behind the Zero's early dominance. But despite its eventual decline, the Zero's impact remained immense. American pilots never forgot the shock of facing it for the first time in their slow, lumbering Brewster Buffaloes. The comparison between the two machines symbolized the larger struggle of the early Pacific War, a technologically bold and aggressive Japan facing a United States unprepared, underestimated, and reliant on outdated equipment in distant theaters. The Zero became the symbol of Japanese air power, not because it was perfect, but because its early opponents, especially the Buffalo, were so profoundly outmatched. Today, historians view the Buffalo with sympathy. It was not an inherently evil design. It was simply overwhelmed by circumstances, mismanagement, and the rapid pace of technological change. The Zero, meanwhile, remains a masterpiece of lightweight aeronautical engineering, a machine that demonstrated the heights of Japan's aviation capabilities. Their clash represents a moment when the future of the Pacific War hung in the balance. The Zero soared, the Buffalo floundered, and the United States learned the lessons that would eventually lead to its aerial dominance. The legacy of this mismatch is still felt today. The Zero lives on as a symbol of early war Japanese might, while the Buffalo is remembered as the aircraft that taught the Allies humility and the necessity of rapid innovation. Without the Zero's shocking superiority over the Buffalo, the United States might not have pursued the technological breakthroughs that later defined the war's outcome. And without the Buffalo's sacrifice, the Zero's legend would never have reached the towering heights that made it America's main enemy in the Pacific sky.